Gareth Sturdy here, who I think goes under the name of @StickyPhysics on Twitter.
I
Gareth,
do.
there's a book out. Tell me all
There
about
is.
it.
Yeah. Well, the book is called "What Should Schools Teach," and it's subtitled uh, "Disciplines, Subjects, and the Pursuit of Truth." In fact, I can wave it on the screen here. It's just come out from UCL Press, and it's a whole bunch of um, different chapters written by different people concerning different subjects in the school curriculum.
Well, that's very succinct. I was hoping you'd continue and expand on that a bit. Perhaps you could tell us who's written chapters. How about that?
Well, you're being a little bit coy here, Martin, because this is probably the point where I point out that you've written a chapter, indeed, in there. So that my chapter, for example, is on physics. And then we've got Alga Siegel-Cuthbert, who's one of the editors, who's written about English teaching, English literature. And then there's chapters on biology, on mathematics, and there's arts in there as well as
Yeah, let's should we get this right?
history.
There's
Yeah,
arts, there's sciences, and there's
indeed.
humanities and languages, I think, isn't there as
Yeah,
well?
that's right. Yep. So Shirley Laws has done a great chapter on modern languages. Yeah,
And also, is it Christine Council's written on history?
correct. That's right.
Uh,
Um,
so quite a few luminaries there, and every chapter is about, I don't know, a couple of thousand words long, and the whole
yeah.
book can be bought for £25 from nearest stockist that's probably closed, so via some online stockist, I would think. And also, it's available free. Tell me about this.
Yeah, you can download currently you can download the whole book for free from the UCL Press website. Probably we can get you the link for that to put up at some point. But
I'll tell you what,
um,
we'll put it down under comments underneath here. We'll put it down there so people can then find themselves a link to it and read it for free.
yeah, it's I think the idea is that uh, this is a book that we're all hoping is going to be really useful for teachers, and so the idea is to get it to as many teachers as possible. So you can get the whole book currently for free, and it's quite a big work. There's loads of chapters covering all sorts of subjects in there, so pretty much all teachers are going to find something in there for them.
But
So
what's
yeah,
what's the overall feel of the book? I mean, why should I even bother to get this free? What's the point? So if I'm a teacher of history, of English, of mathematics, geography, whatever it is, why should I bother? Whilst especially at the moment, because I'm up to here in online teaching, etc., etc. Why should I bother going over to have a look at this book?
well, I mean, that's a really good point, because now, perhaps more than any other time, when teachers are sort of atomized, perhaps sitting at home, or even if they're going into school, still not kind of engaging in their usual way of teaching, it's a great time to do a bit of reflection on what the job's all about, to kind of balance out the concerns about, oh, have I got my camera switched on, have I got have I got all the technology right, and where are my usual teaching materials, I can't use them for this particular lesson. While all that's going on, um, it'd be a good idea, I think, for teachers to think about the broader questions and about the bigger issues about their subject. So I think it's a really timely um, time for the book. But that question, what should schools teach? I think the whole reason that we all contributed to the book is because it's such a kind of rarely discussed question, both in teacher training and in the profession itself. So, why do we teach the subjects we do? Why do we teach the particular aspects of those subjects that we do? Why do we even teach subjects at all? Why don't we teach across themes or skills, or why subjects? So it's trying to answer that question, but uniquely, it's trying to answer it from the perspective of each subject. So maths answer to why should we teach subjects is going to be quite different to, say, something from art or, languages or something like that.
Okay. So if I go along there and have a look, is it telling me what to teach?
No, it's not. If you're looking for, here's a breakdown of your subject, and here's pedagogy, here's how to teach, for example, in physics, here's how to teach Newton's laws or something. It's not going to do that. It's a more reflective book that looks at why these things that we often teach without sort of thinking about it, because it's just there, it's part of the subject. Why does mathematics, for example, teach geometry, let's say? It digs down into that and says why this particular part is important. If you to think of any subject, all the possible things you could teach, you can't fit that into the time available. And so you have to bring some sort of process of judgment to bear. And that's what the book is looking at. What are the processes that each subject use to evaluate what is worth teaching, what is perhaps something that isn't worth teaching in schools, but maybe might be encountered in university or something.
But isn't it influenced by the idea of powerful knowledge? Certainly, it's not sort of looking at 21st century skills as a book, from what I can ascertain.
No, that's right. I would say that um, rather than just the concept of powerful knowledge, which lots of people talk about these days, but I'm not so sure that everybody really talks about it in the way that the authors of that concept really meant it. It's become a bit of a buzzword. Rather than just talking about powerful knowledge, I think it's more correct to say it comes from what's called a social realist perspective, which is a sort of concept that comes from the sociology of education, and views what happens in schools in a particular way. And I suppose you could sum that up by talking about the idea of kind of special knowledge and then everyday knowledge. And this is a concept that originates with the sociologist Durkheim, who talked about sacred and profane knowledge. The idea that the kind of knowledge you get in schools is somehow special, different, in a kind of class of its own to knowledge that one might pick up at home or in the everyday world. So it begins from that perspective, and then says, okay, so if there's something special about school subjects, what does that specialness consist in? What are the particular reasons for studying, for example, English literature? What are the reasons for studying arts? What are the reasons for looking at history? And then going further into that and saying, well, okay, within history, what are the things that schools are trying to do with that subject?
Okay, so if I'm a history teacher and I want to go along to this book to find out perhaps some of the arguments from a socially realist point of view, which in itself would be something that might start to make me a bit nervous because it sounds a bit political, perhaps, or something. Is it frightening me? Perhaps putting me off the idea? I don't know. Tell me, why should I go along to this book? That's what I'm trying to get the essence of. What is it about this book that is different than other books, and what is it arguing against, perhaps?
Well, for a start, I suppose what social realism might sound a bit like socialism, perhaps, or something like that. I don't know. And you might think, oh, is this is this sort of some kind of political ideology? No, it's not that. I mean, I suppose in a sense, it could be considered a political question. What should schools teach, given that politicians and the state and government have an awfully big say over how schools operate and the kind of things that they should teach? And that there is a national curriculum, and that is set by the Department for Education. So there are political questions there, but this is not a political book in that sense. And in fact, there's an enormous number of writers in it, and I'm sure that all of them come from very different, political positions themselves. Um, the question of what should schools teach, I think it is there's another version of that question which children in school always ask, and we're all familiar with it. And it's that question, oh, well, why do we have to learn this? So why do we have to learn physics? Or why do we have to learn this bit? Because it's really boring, and it's every teacher has encountered that question. Now, so often today, I think teachers don't have a ready answer for that question. They're not really, everyone knows that question gets asked, but they're not really prepared for what to say. And I think people reach instinctively for things like, oh, this will help you get a good job, or perhaps they might not couch it in these terms um, to pupils, but the teachers are thinking in the back of their mind, some of my kids come from more deprived backgrounds, and if they learn this stuff, then they can go to a top university or something like that. But actually, I think the answer to why do we have to learn this, I think it's a really good question for a start. And I think when children ask that, they're doing something really important. And I think the answer is a lot deeper than just it'll help you get a good job, it'll help you get into a good university or something like that. So that's why teachers should go for it, not to look for ideology, but to look for a kind of theoretical, a rigorous intellectual underpinning for why they do what they do.
So if I'm in my department at a school, let's say it's some wonderful day in the future when we are back in schools, and I take this book along and say it's an inspiration perhaps about how we should change curriculum in any way in the school. How, I mean, we're obviously starting from a completely hypothetical point here. So we don't know what the curriculum like is in Saint Hypotheticals, this new school I've just
I
opened.
want to go there. So hypothetical. If they've got a
But
job, I'm interested in teaching that.
but there it is. There we have it. Um, it's different than the 21st century skills curriculum idea, I should think, and I'm getting a sense of that. Uh, but in terms of the current curriculum debates which are going on out there, some of which are, of course, about a decolonization of the curriculum, some of which are about having more technical and practical aspects to learning and all those things. It's not necessarily taking stands on those things in that sort of detail, but what is it doing if it isn't
Yeah,
doing that?
yeah. It's not taking a stand on particular issues. I think the whole point is to get at that issue that the curriculum, what we teach, is a conversation. It's a dialectical kind of process in which you have to thrash out with your colleagues and with the wider community of your subject. You have to thrash out what is important to teach and what isn't. And so just by kind of asking that question, what should schools teach, it leads you into a discussion of what is more technically known as disciplinary knowledge. In other words, in your subject, what are the questions that your subject asks? What is your subject interested in? How does it establish what is true? What does true mean in your subject? These kind of questions, these are all things that teachers should have at the front of their mind, that they should be thinking about, I would argue, to be an effective teacher. But it's those kind of questions that are so rarely asked. So imagine a group of teachers in a department sitting around, perhaps at the end of term or the start of term or whatever, saying, okay, what are we going to teach this year and how are we going to do it? And they'll probably just reach, for example, for an exam specification. uh, we need to know this for the exam, or they might reach for the idea that we need something practical. We need some hands-on things, so we can develop some physical skills or something like that. Well, all those things might be really important, but the whole point, I think, is to get a more nuanced conversation going, in which we say, but why those particular things? Why, for example, the instrumental ends of our subject? Why this will help you pass the exam? Why should that take any more precedence over, say, the way the subject has historically developed over time. You know, the way something like economics or something was taught, say, 30 years ago. Does that mean we still have to teach that in the same way? Um, or does it mean that it has changed and we should look back to how things were done perhaps in the past to see what was important then and whether any of those things are still important now? It's opening up the conversation of what are we doing here? What are we really trying to achieve? Is the end of everything, for example, just to get as many particular grades out of this exercise as possible? I don't think so. But we don't really create a space in which teachers can engage in that kind of conversation. And, you know, perhaps it's not necessarily so easy for teachers to know where to start with that. And so that's the whole point of having this conversation, having this book, thinking about disciplinary knowledge, school subjects. Why are they important?
Okay, and is it basically for secondary teachers? Can primary teachers get a look in here? And is it very much based in the English experience of education?
Um, Regarding secondary or primary, I mean, it's not particularly aimed at one kind of phase or another. However, it is about school subjects. Okay, so it's, I suppose, more naturally leans towards secondary education because the division into subjects is clearer there. But if I were a primary teacher, um, I'd be having to teach lots of different subjects all myself. Maybe some of them I'm not so necessarily um, expert in, and I'd like to be thinking, why do I need to do this subject? Why do I need to do any science? I'm not particularly trained in teaching high level science, so why have I got to put this into my lessons in primary school? And I think looking at the reasons that this is a sort of established part of the curriculum and why it should continue to be so, I think will enormously help primary education. So it's not aimed necessarily at secondary school teachers, although obviously that's probably going to make up the majority of the readership. But there's plenty in there for primary teachers as well,
And English schools?
and English schools. Sorry, yes. Um, I mean, again, it's not explicitly aimed at any particular education system. I mean, if you go, for example, to schools in Scotland or to an Ireland or wherever, you're still going to find schools teaching these subjects and teaching in a subject based way, and the debate is still live in in the various nations on whether school subjects should remain. So, for example, in Wales, the discussion over the Welsh curriculum is, as I'm sure you're aware, is really intense in terms of the kind of content and what it's aiming at, and the sort of model of the learner at the centre of that curriculum. I think this book is a really good intervention into that debate.
Okay, which this sort of moves us into curriculum in a broader sense beyond the book itself as to whether we should have subject based curricula. And a lot of this argument, of course, takes place in primary education. Certainly, it's literacy, numeracy, and then topic or project, or should it be more subject based from earlier and earlier and earlier, ever earlier, perhaps from the age of 7? I don't know. We could argue that for till the cows come home. But also key stage 3. I mean, I remember key stage 3 people trying to collapse the curriculum at key stage 3 more and more to make it more project based, to make it more like primary school in some ways, in order real world learning and things like that came into play. So should a curriculum be, let's say, perhaps arbitrarily stuck into these subject areas so rigidly that perhaps it's makes some kids be put off and doesn't have any sense of what the real world is, where we don't think entirely in terms of subject areas? I mean, what do you think of that generally?
Well, I mean, that's actually where the book starts. In fact, Alex Standish has got a great short essay at the start about why school subjects and why they are important. So anyone that's interested in that that whole debate is, I would recommend going and reading that chapter, because it sets out a really clear argument about why school subjects are important. And there's also some Alka's written in the book about the importance of aesthetics and imagination in the curriculum. So it takes a really interesting slant on what you just raised, which is, yes, that school subjects must be anchored in things in the world around us. They must be rooted, if you like, in sensible objects, things that are in the world of the senses. That's really important. But it's kind of how you handle that that's the important thing. Now, I think the question for those people that say, let's, for example, focus on the 21st century skills curriculum, the really important question is, why in particular? What is the reason for doing that? For example, in my subject, physics, a lot of about what's going on in physics is about a particular way of approaching the world in terms of quantifying the world and creating structures of order that evaluate the world. That's what the subject is really all about. So by learning physics, you are engaging in that way of thinking. It's almost like entering a particular lens, or looking through a particular lens into a world and seeing everything in those terms. Now, the world is bigger than that, and so you also need um, more sort of overtly creative ways of approaching the world that you might encounter through literature or through painting or so on. But the question is, how do you get that kind of knowledge? Do you just teach it by teaching, today we're going to teach creativity? Or do you approach that by saying, here are the creative subjects, here's how each one of them looks through the world. It's a different perspective. And this all contributes, along with the science and the humanities and everything else, all these different ways of thinking, they all contribute to a kind of rounded way of making sense of the world. And the argument in the book, and the argument that I think is really important, is that only through these different perspectives on the world, these different ways of seeing, these different ways of making sense, these different ways of inquiring into the world, can you build up an authentically rounded view of how to make sense of the world. If you just try to isolate, say, critical thinking, well, you have to be critical about something, and
Well, let's
exactly
be
what that is the subject. The
let's
school
be
subject.
critical about this then. So here I am, just a little amount of critique perhaps, but if I was going to say, kids, right, let's all get together into groups and we're going to make a podcast. And what do we need to make a podcast? We need cameras. What's the best camera to get? What are the best lenses to get? What's the best sound? Blah blah blah. Here we go. I'm doing physics. I'm doing aesthetics. I'm doing all those things that you were talking about. But I'm not doing them rigidly stuck in subjects. I'm finding them through real world experiences, and there I find out all I need to know. I follow what we need to know, and we in the group, we collaborate together and we say, right, oh, what else do we need for our podcast? We go, well, guests, who are we going to study? Well, let's, who are we going to ask onto the show? Well, I'm going to ask Gareth Sturdy to talk about physics. Oh, I don't know. Tell me. You know what I'm talking about.
If you get behind a camera in your little group that you've just set up here, and do you want to film this, or or you're making a podcast and you've got some microphones or whatever, little Johnny is going to go and stand over there in the corner and hope that his voice is going to be as loud as everybody else's. If you've had an understanding of mathematics and science, you'll understand that he's not at the right angle to be seen by the camera or to be picked up by the microphone. Okay, it was a really simple, trivial example, but he doesn't appreciate yet about angles and distances and just how things work. So all of the separate elements that you've just talked about all involve that question about, well, how does that particular thing I'm thinking about work? Well, you need a theoretical framework to build all those thoughts up first, and then you can put them together. So, to throw the question back at you, if your little group is going to, if the purpose of the exercise is collaboration, what are you going to do? You're going to get your group together and say, okay, kids, let's collaborate. The question immediately after that is on what? Well, is the on what important or not? Are we saying, let's just collaborate? And to be honest, it doesn't really matter what we collaborate on. That's unimportant. Or is it better to have a framework, have a project, have something that says this is the substance of what we're doing, and through it we will learn how to collaborate, we will learn how to use cameras and microphones, we will learn how to be dramatic. I mean, in your subject, Martin, can you just teach drama, or do you need plays to teach, or some sort of dramatic work to teach drama through? And therefore, is there not, which plays are better than others?
Well, there you go. I mean, of course, if I'm saying, looking at it from the podcast point of view, we do in drama put together groups of kids to make their own plays together. And this can involve starting from nothing, but we still need the focus of make a play. And then you're saying, right, well, what type of play shall we make? Well, we start to constrain it in certain ways. So you can't have any words in this play. So that gets rid of the idea of the script, which is helpful. But we're into silence, but we can have musical background, so you can see the constraints I'm bringing in. But the question is, the constraints I bring in are quite important. So that's kind of what you were saying there. As soon as we say we're going to collaborate on something, the constraints we bring in, what are we going to collaborate on, becomes the most important question. And really, that's where subjects perhaps come in. But still, I still want to argue about this point about what you need to know first, I think. About critical thinking, you're saying you need to know stuff first. Well, yes, to some extent. But how much physics do I need to know consciously? And that's another aspect of this, perhaps. But how much physics do I need to know consciously to cross the road?
Well, it depends. I mean, it depends in entirely how you want to kind of couch that question. Because I would say that crossing the road, for example, is what you'd call everyday knowledge. Yeah. So, sure, the question, how much physics do I need to cross the road? Well, there is an element of that, actually. There is an element of understanding, how things move, and speeds and relative speeds and all of that kind of thing. Some children want to dash across the road and they don't realize that they can't run faster than the car that's approaching. That's a physics question, okay? But actually what you're talking about is what I would call everyday knowledge, profane knowledge in Durkheim's term. The thing about physics is it gets us to analyze situations of things moving in a completely different way to the perspective of someone trying to cross a road. It sets up a totally different and perhaps somewhat artificial or largely theoretical way of understanding how things move, but it takes you further. It leads you to a very different place. So when you want to sort of perhaps focus on, say, writing a play, but you can't use you can't use any dialogue or something. Does the group or the students sitting down to do that? Do they do that without any kind of awareness whether anyone's ever done this in history before, and whether it worked and how it worked and what effect it had and how it might have changed things? Do they do that without regard to that or not? If they do want to take account of that, where do they go to find out that information, that knowledge? Well, ultimately, it tracks back to the discipline, if you like, the subject as it is in the university, the way that it's kind of seriously sat down and thought about as a thing in itself, the history of drama or the teaching of drama. Sure, you can get children to write plays or do science experiments without any awareness of that, without any knowledge of that. But who is going to be the better dramatist? Who's going to be the better scientist? Who's going to be the better person? The person that's got that hinterland or the one without it?
Yeah, I think we're the danger is here, of course. I'm sort of looking for examples and talking about examples from physics, and you're trying to talk about examples from drama. And I'm thinking, well, you could actually do that with very little knowledge, and you build up the knowledge as you teach it through. And of course, I'm
But
thinking of the experience of teaching kids mime, of mask,
but
of
Martin, that
silent
is the
movie
point.
acting, but starting it with very small build-ups of knowledge on the way, but that's within the subject. I don't want to get sidetracked too much into the physics and the drama worlds, but I
But I
but
just
you
want to
but you
say
did
that's
go back to
important.
Durkheim there. So the sacred and profane, I think, is the important point here about everyday knowledge and having subject-based knowledge and the relationship between the two. Now, in the book launch that was launched yesterday, so we
Mhm.
were both at the book launch, albeit virtually, yesterday. I think one of the last questions was about this, about placing things in the real world and sort of giving it some sort of relationship between everyday knowledge and the importance of that, and answering the questions to the kids, if you like, about why you're learning it. Somewhere along the line, it's not entirely abstract, or is it?
That's a really big and very, very interesting question for me, especially, my subject, which is partly hugely theoretical, but also very, very practical. That's the kind of the whole point of physics, I think. Um, I am one of those people that thinks it's really important to root things in the world of the senses. And in that sense, I think I'm an empiricist. Okay, but there's two different sorts of empiricism, certainly in Britain, and one of them kind of means the opposite of that. One of them means to root everything from a kind of evidence point of view. So you have to have scientific, top grade scientific evidence for everything that you think and do. And in a way, I think by not focusing on what each subject in the curriculum brings and how it looks at the world in a different way, we have actually, in latter years, fallen into this position of being very abstract about things. And for example, looking at someone's progress in a subject such as yours, where you've just said, it's a very real world kind of situation in drama, or a very sensible world situation. Even in subjects like that, someone's understanding and development in the subject is reduced into highly abstract concepts. Need I mention things like progress 8 and so on, which are sort of Byzantine in their approach to what it is that we're doing in teaching. So with the absence of thinking about how your subject works and how it makes claims about the world, we seem to sort of fall back into a kind of scientistic way of approaching education. It's sort of partly instrumental and it's partly kind of scientific, and it's really not the kind of education that I think anyone actually really wants.
Okay, now I'm conscious that you have to leave us shortly. So I'm going to perhaps ask one final question about science and science in the world as it is now, and talking about Byzantine sort of relationships. We find now we have scientists, highly expert people, interviewed by interviewers on TV and radio and other forms of media. And ne'er the twain shall meet. There's this sort of people interviewing scientists wanting facts and truth and give me answers. And scientists trying, the rhetoric of science is a bit more, especially science when it's going into the unknown, sort of
Mm.
guarded and sort of not going into that. And is this because we have been taught at school generally, to thus us non-science experts, to think of science as a list of facts, of things
Mm.
that are right, the things that are true. We were talking about truth and fact earlier. And actually, science is more about probability and other things like that. Is this that we've been taught it wrongly in the past, or is it because it's just we're going into the unknown in this pandemic?
No, I think it's not that we've been taught wrongly, but I think it is this question of where you put your emphases when you're teaching. So we have government ministers, we have people in the street, we have everybody saying, let's follow the science. And as anyone working in science knows, there's no such thing as the science. You know, science is intrinsically deep within its makeup. It's a process. Again, it's a conversation. It's a dialectical process in which one point of view is put up for examination, and then hopefully contradicted with another point of view, and some kind of judgment has to be formed. The moment we stray into territory where we say the science says, and then worse, the science says, so we must all do this, that's when we get into all sorts of problems. And I think that's where we see a lot of the social tensions today around these ideas of skepticism, because we've got quite a kind of uh, quite a poor relationship to skepticism. And this is not an argument for sort of COVID denial or anything like that. What I'm talking about is a deeper, richer understanding of how science establishes what it thinks is true. And I think that should be at the heart of not just government policy, public health policy, but it should be at the heart of what teachers in science labs and classrooms are doing. Because if you get that across in the subject, and it's not an easy job to get that across, if you can do that there, people grow up into people who understand what it is that science can do and what it is that science can't do. And you have a broader, richer perspective of opinion uh, in society. And I think you have a better society for that.
But of course, in the world of communication particularly in the health crisis, you also have the need to tell people something and tell them damn well to do it, because you need an authoritarian stance that needs to be relatively simple. Do this, and you need. They say why? Well, the scientists say so. It helps the authoritarian. Speaking as a parent, you need you need some backing
Exactly.
up.
If someone says, look, this is really serious, you need to do this now, what does that all come down to? It comes down to trust. Now, if you trust science because it's something that you have been let into, you found your way through, and you think, oh, I see, right, I see why people think that makes sense now. If that's your attitude to science, then you're going to trust the scientists. And if the scientists say, look, we really all need to do this now, you'll be inclined to say, well, okay. If science is something that has been told to you as almost a supernatural force, this is true, and it must be true because science, then you are not going to trust it, or at least large numbers of people aren't going to trust it. And you are going to have precisely the situation in society that I think we have today. So it just shows that if schools can think a little bit more, excuse me, about why it is, for example, they teach science or any subject, and get that across to the kids, I think we end up actually at the other end of the process with quite a different society, and possibly a more better functioning society.
Gareth, it's been fascinating to talk with you this morning. It'll go out at some point whenever people come across it. It might not even be morning to them, so that might not help them sort of relate to our conversation in that way. But I'll certainly want you to come back, because I think these questions that we've just raised are fascinating. We could talk about it for a very long time. Could you hold the book up again if you haven't got rid of it
Yeah,
in the meantime?
I don't often get the chance to wave books in the air, but yeah, there's it's a nice big thick book. I think the print version actually is really lovely. But if for whatever reason you can't run to that, or you don't want to, then as I say, if you go to the UCL Press website, and we'll put the link in the chat, I think, and you can download the whole thing for free. So that means you can't really give this away as a giveaway on your show, which perhaps I should shut up at this point.
I think we could give it away. We could give away a link And if you've got a copy there, which you clearly have, we could give that away.
I'm not giving this away. This is dear to me. Although I do have several others.
I'll,
Yeah, I'm sure we can get you a book to
that
give
would be
away.
great.
Or
So we'll
more than
do
one.
that.
More
What
than
a
one.
wonderful idea. So we'll raffle 2 free copies of the book, and I've just managed to get that into 2. Did you notice that? It was one.
Yeah, very
It
good.
was a copy. It's now 2. We'll raffle away the book, and thank you, Gareth, and hope you have a rest of a wonderful day and teaching online or whatever you're doing at the moment. Good luck with it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Cheers, Martin.